All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming down today. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of today's book, you could just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We will get it signed, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. So this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Mr. Ozzy Inguanzo and his new book, Zombies on Film, The Definitive Story of Undead Cinema. Mr. Inguanzo is a writer and filmmaker whose work in motion pictures spans all facets of the industry. His experience includes Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, Green Lantern, Oz the Great and Powerful, and The Wolverine. And he is the author of the previous book, Constructing Green Lantern from Page to Screen. In this book, Mr. Inguanzo takes readers on an illustrative journey through all 9 decades of undead cinema, chronicling popular culture's most terrifyingly enduring and endearing monsters in the very medium that created and shaped them, the movies. Right now I'm going to play a brief trailer, and when that's done, we'll welcome Ozzy up to the podium. One moment, please.
We were riding in a cemetery, Johnny and me, to put a wreath on my father's grave. And then this man started walking up the road. He came slowly, and Johnny kept teasing me and saying, "He's coming to get you, Barbara." And I went up to this man, and I was going to apologize. And he grabbed me! And he ripped at me!
Your brother is dead.
No! My mother is not dead! Please help me!
The killers are eating the flesh of the people they kill. They appear to be in a kind of trance.
Radiation is not the cause of the mutation.
I can't speak for the entire military at this time, General.
Everything is being done that can be done.
If you had a gun, shoot him in the head. If you don't, get yourself a club or a torch. Beat him or burn him.
It is happening.
What do they think? We're imagining all this?
It was dead, but it opened its eyes and tried to move.
A living dead.
No one is safe.
Those things are going to be at every window and door in this place. You hear me? I told you they turned over our car. Get down into the cellar.
I'm fighting for everything up here.
Get out of here! You've got to have food down there. He's insane. He's insane.
Dead bodies will continue to be transported.
Bastards. Bastards.
They're coming to get you.
Wow. Okay, folks, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Ozzy Inguanzo.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Books and Books. And it's wonderful to be back in Miami and here at Books and Books. I'm honored to be here. So a lot of people have asked me recently. I was just in Utah doing an event similar to this with a documentary filmmaker who had a documentary called Doc of the Dead about zombies. And a woman asked us at the panel afterwards, she said, you guys, how do you guys do it? You guys must be so depressed, living with zombies all the time and being, fanatics of zombies and all of this. And we said, we're storytellers, and the book before this was about comic book characters, and he's done other documentaries as well. So for us, we're storytellers, and when my publisher came to me and said, we really want to do a zombie book, and I was interested in it. I had been a fan of zombie movies, but not to the point where I knew that much about zombies. But I really found it interesting. I really found an interesting story there with how the zombie genre evolved throughout 90 years, and it's really an interesting story about just storytelling in general, and their presence in pop culture and how that grew. What the book does, it takes readers through this evolutionary process that happened, almost like an open collaboration with different storytellers throughout time, and how that affected the genre, and how the genre kind of grew into what we know zombies as today, flesh-eating, relatives who've passed on, who are coming to eat us alive, basically. and I think that that the other interesting point is that the genre overall was, really brought to light by independent filmmakers, and not by the Hollywood studio system throughout the years. And at this point, it became so successful that Hollywood has kind of taken the genre and now made films like World War Z. But at the time, the studio snubbed their nose a lot at the zombie genre, and they saw these monsters as low rent monsters. And but what really makes zombies interesting, also, that I found in my research and spending time in this genre, was that that unlike vampires and ghosts and demons and werewolves and even Frankenstein's monster, which all trace their lineage back to familiar literary works, I think that the modern day perception of zombie lore was created and defined in the 20th century and at the movies through different filmmakers. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book. I'm going to take you back to the 1930s when the first zombie movie was made, and how that came about. By 1930, talking pictures were heralding Hollywood's golden age, and horror films were emerging as a successful trend with cinema-goers. Studios were increasingly adapting renowned literary titles of the macabre, delivering terrifying chills and shocking thrills. The most notable hits at the start of the decade were Universal Pictures' adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula in 1931, directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1931, directed by James Whale and starring Boris Karloff, and Paramount Pictures' retelling of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1931, under the direction of Ruben Mamoulian, starring Frederick March. These early talkies set the standard for American horror, and their success at the box office launched a slate of horror films that extended well beyond the decade. For Edward and Victor Halperin, two brothers from Chicago who had found moderate success in Hollywood producing romantic melodramas for the major studios of the silent era, Victor would direct, Edward would produce. Making talkies during the Great Depression proved challenging, but they recognized the public's growing interest in the horror genre and decided to embark on an original property that would exploit America's newfound curiosity in voodoo lore. The idea for the Halperin brothers' new film originated from the pages of William Seabrook's 1929 nonfiction travelogue about his exotic adventures in Haiti, called The Magic Island. It recounted dark tales of native voodoo rites that essentially brought the dead back to life as zombies. But Seabrook's shocking first-person accounts were extraordinary and nothing like the miraculous narratives Westerners had been familiar with, such as Christ's divine resurrection of Lazarus, as depicted in the Holy Bible's Gospel of John. Zombies were reanimated corpses without souls, bodies without any physical liberty or personal autonomy. They existed at the mercy of voodoo sorcerers and functioned as servile labor. Seabrook's lurid encounters challenged science and defied religion, so naturally the public was captivated. The Halperin brothers seized their inspiration and commissioned writer Garnet Weston to develop and write an original concept and screenplay for what would become the Zombies' feature film debut, White Zombie, in 1932. The eerie melodrama follows blonde Madeline Shore Short to Haiti to marry her dashing fiancé, Neil Parker. In order to prevent the marriage, Madeline's secret admirer, Charles Beaumont, invites the couple to stay at his tropical mansion and offers to host their wedding. Unable to win her devotion through traditional means, Beaumont seeks the assistance of a malevolent necromancer who turns Madeline into a zombie. That sinister role went to Bela Dracula Lugosi, whom the Halperins managed to secure for a nominal fee 1 year after his breakout success playing Universal's blood-sucking Count. Lugosi plays the aptly named Murder Legendre with evil aplomb. His devilish widow's peak, downturned mustache, pitchfork goatee, and dastardly upturned eyebrows were created by master Hollywood makeup artist Jack P. Pierce. Pierce also fashioned cinema's first zombies into pale, living dead gargoyles. Each was an individual character with a distinct look and wardrobe. Applying dark makeup to the hollow areas of each performer's face enhanced bony features and bugged-out eyes. Pierce was the notable head of Universal's makeup department and on loan to the Halperins for the production. Known for creating Boris Karloff's character-defining look as the monster in Frankenstein, he also fashioned the classic makeup designs for The Mummy in 1932, The Black Cat in 1934, Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, and The Wolfman in 1941. An innovator in the field, Pierce's enduring work went on to influence generations of future special makeup effects artists like Rick Baker, Tom Savini, and Greg Nicotero. White Zombie was reportedly shot in just 11 days, mostly on the Universal Studio lot in Southern California for under $75,000. A paltry sum compared to the scale of Universal's Dracula, which was estimated at $341,000, and Frankenstein, estimated at $291,000. Although the Zombies' first cinematic outing was independently bankrolled by a motion picture financing firm out of New York and not a major studio, the Halperin brothers' years of experience had shaped them into savvy and resourceful movie makers. So they managed to achieve high production values with studio-level quality for a fraction of the cost. Their art director, Ralph Berger, a veteran of movie serials, rented and expertly repurposed pre-existing set pieces and scenery from the epic horror films of the era. Berger rearranged the pillars and hanging balcony set from The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, the dark corridors used in Frankenstein, and Castle Dracula's Great Hall and Staircase for Murder Legendre's Haitian Castle. Technically, Lugosi was back home, but the audience wouldn't recognize it. Like Dr. Frankenstein piecing together various human body parts to create a new man, the Halperins and their crew used Hollywood parts to craft a new kind of story, and they gave birth to a new type of monster. And the film proved to be immensely successful at the box office. Released through United Artists on July 28, 1932, White Zombie reportedly earned $1.7 million at the box office. By comparison, in June of 1932, Dracula and Frankenstein had made $1.2 million and $1.4 million, respectively. So that was the launch of, what many consider the launch of the zombie genre, and where the word zombie was used in a film. To give you some more context, I'll read from another excerpt of the book and discuss what happened with the evolution of the zombies. And motion pictures have always been a predominantly commercial medium, the product of a somewhat paradoxical synthesis between commerce and art. While film producers and financiers traditionally choose what films to make based on reliable trends and bottom lines, the writers and directors they partner with are typically storytellers, and they have something to say. The most talented are able to craft economical, yet commercially thrilling premises while making valuable social observations. It was at that precise alignment of commerce and artistry where the modern-day zombie was conceived. If necessity is the mother of all inventions, then George A. Romero is the father. Romero's 1968 masterpiece, Night of the Living Dead, which he directed and co-wrote with John A. Russo on a shoestring budget, reset and revitalized the Living Dead canon without even referencing or uttering the word zombie. Romero not only crafted a disturbingly fresh reimagination of that familiar and cost-effective trope, but also masterfully integrated a cautionary tale about society's inability to communicate and its subsequent disintegration. These social themes, combined with Romero's nihilistic approach to the material, still affect audiences today. And although it took years to get recognized, that film's transcendent impact on popular culture was evident by the turn of the century, when the Library of Congress selected Night of the Living Dead for preservation in the National Film Registry as a motion picture deemed, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant to the United States. Since their motion picture debut in 1932, zombies have always struggled to maintain a respectable screen presence alongside Hollywood's A-list monsters. Producers generally resorted to zombies when searching for alternative low-cost antagonists to put in their horror flicks. For the most part, zombies are rights-free, so no costly literary or intellectual rights need to be paid to use them. High-wage movie stars aren't needed to play them. The roles of faceless zombie hordes usually go to lower salaried extras, and zombies don't necessarily require extravagant prosthetic makeup effects or expensive costume builds. In fact, you could just get homeless itinerants to play your zombies, as director Lucio Fulci is rumored to have done for his spectacle of gore, Zombie, in 1979. Given those circumstances, the Living Dead have spent much of their cinematic history starring in obscure, low-budget exploitation films. Fortunately, though, every so often, visionary filmmakers like Romero and Fulci emerge onto the scene, breathing new life into a stale, left-for-dead concept by delivering relevant and shocking experiences for audiences. It's this spirit of independent filmmaking that has made zombies thrive, and what has consistently carried them into new eras. This is how legend is created. By his own assertions, Romero was always partial to the traditional Caribbean zombie archetype seen in White Zombie in 1932, referring to them as, quote, blue-collar monsters. Under the hypnotic spell of an evil voodoo master, these zombie minions did all the heavy lifting while their master rested comfortably in his castle. However, Romero's interpretation eliminated the voodoo master and transplanted the Caribbean-centric Living Dead concept to modern-day suburbia, refashioning them as regular working-class corpses, our neighbors, friends, and family. By making the threat relatable to audiences, the cinematic experience suddenly became more disturbing. The roots of those influences can be found in author Richard Matheson's 1954 post-apocalyptic novel, I Am Legend, which Romero acknowledges was his greatest single inspiration in creating Night of the Living Dead. The premise centers on the last lone survivor of a pandemic plague that wiped out the rest of humanity by turning them into vampires. Released 4 years prior to Night of the Living Dead, the novel's film adaptation, The Last Man on Earth in 1964, starring Vincent Price in the titular role, was subsequently remade as The Omega Man in 1971 with Charlton Heston, and I Am Legend in 2007, starring Will Smith. Matheson's post-apocalyptic premise and diseased antagonists resonated with Romero, who wondered, if I Am Legend portrays mankind's revolutionary last days, what about the beginning of the end? How did those first last days unfold? What if these are them? What if the creatures weren't vampires? Discussing the value of cultural transfers, filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola once invoked an essay by French novelist Honoré de Balzac about a young writer who stole some of his prose. Quote, as for young writers taking what we're doing and copying it and letting that be a starting point, we ask you to do that. We're proud to be part of that link. We did it to those that came before us. So please steal from it, because you can't steal from it. Because as you work, it will become your own. And then someone will come and steal from that, and in that way, we're alive forever. And Coppola added, I've always encouraged young artists to, at first, when they're young, to take a piece and start to rip it off, because that's how you will find your own voice or style. And that's good. That's what it's supposed to be. That's the cultural transfer that happens from generation to generation, end quote. So for over 80 years, these ravenous cinematic corpses have been feeding, thriving, and evolving on the imaginations and creative works of a talented stable of writers, directors, producers, actors, illustrators, special makeup effects artists, and video game designers. These stewards of storytelling have paid the legacy forward and have left a lasting and indelible impression on the subgenre, one which the zombies will carry on with them forever. So in doing this research, I found that all these filmmakers were inspired by those that came before them and inspired by the films that came before them, but they were also inspired by the time that they lived in. And in the 1940s, after World War II, a lot of the tone of horror films started to change because people were coming home from the war, and that was what was on people's minds, so they took on a lighter tone, and we saw a lot of comedies in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, with the resurgence of the Cold War and the nuclear age, we started to see science fiction make its way into the zombie genre. And that's what really influenced Romero to do Night of the Living Dead, and aside from Richard Matheson's post-apocalyptic novel. After that movie came out, it became such a huge hit in drive-thrus around the country that a lot of very shrewd film producers in Europe and here thought the zombie concept was just a great way to approach making films and marketing these films. So what you saw in the 70s were a lot of films that would take popular films of that time, like Carrie or Jaws or things like that, and they would attach the zombie tropes to them and as a marketing ploy to make all these films. So you saw a lot of different films in the 1970s. You saw a blaxploitation zombie film called Sugar Hill. Like I said, a Carrie kind of knockoff with zombies called The Child, and it kind of started to get, I think, gorier. Zombies were never seen as a gory genre, but to exploit the genre, filmmakers like Fulci added the spectacle of gore to these movies. And in the 1980s, there were more zombie movies produced and low budget zombie movies than ever. And it really, I think, was 1983's Thriller, the Michael Jackson video, that brought zombies to pop culture prominence. Aside from, the fringe kind of element that would normally see zombie movies at the time, and who were fans of the zombie movies. So it kind of brought them to the living room. But I think by the 1980s, the gore and the zombie movies had outstayed their welcome, and people had grown tired of seeing zombie movies, and the gore and the blood was kind of like had run dry. So it really came back with the advent of video games in Japan, and a very popular video game called Resident Evil that Capcom released, that was inspired by Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and that was called, it was survival horror was what the video game genre was. You had to survive being in a locked up place as the dead popped out at you. And that really brought, I think video games even now have brought the zombies back to the fore in the 90s. And then because the genre is so malleable, you had other filmmakers come in like Danny Boyle with 28 Days Later. Now the zombies ran, and then the zombies, there were infections, and they kind of just played on the same trope, which made it interesting. And since then they've just continued to be produced. At the Sundance Film Festival this year, there were 3 movies that were zombie related, and the worldwide phenomenon that was World War Z with Brad Pitt was kind of a studio embracing wholeheartedly the concept of a zombie film and putting in hundreds of millions of dollars in visual effects and production costs to produce that film. And finally reaching that that pop cultural prominence that the zombies sought out, almost usurping Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula, which had originally competed against them early on in the 30s. So it's I think the open source nature, open source collaboration of this genre led a lot of filmmakers to let filmmakers to contribute to the genre, and therefore kept it alive a lot longer and kept it from going stale. So those are things that I found fascinating about this kind of underdog of the horror genre and this underdog monster, and now how successful it's been recently. we can open it up to questions, and if you guys have any questions about the zombie genre or zombies in cinema, we can talk about it. Yes.
Do you think part of the fascination with zombies is the preoccupation with this culture of staying alive, not dying and not aging, and the zombies are a way to say, well, we don't really die, we can stay around or come back.
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely when George Romero wrote Night of the Living Dead, his commentary was not about the dead, it was about the living. And the zombies are, probably the easiest villains to overcome. They're dead, they're very slow and lumbering, but as they come at you, it's really the living who are discussing amongst themselves who's in power, who's not in power, what's the best course of action to take, and all of this. And meanwhile, the zombies are getting closer and closer and closer. So really, a lot of the best zombie movies are about the living and how really they overcome within themselves whatever the situation is. In this case, invading hordes of zombies, and they usually end. They're usually pretty unsuccessful because they're always bickering amongst themselves as the zombies get closer and closer and closer. And that was the case with Night of the Living Dead. But I think the public's fascination also has to do with the fact that zombies are just great villains. They're like the Nazis. It's just like everybody. They're not really. There's not a lot of a backstory there. They just want to consume your flesh and kill you and turn you into them. And I think people find that very easy to recognize that we just have to kill them all before they do that to us. And so I found that a lot of the good zombie movies tell stories about the living. And Shaun of the Dead, which is a very renowned British film by Edgar Wright, talks about that, about a man trying to win over his girlfriend in the midst of this zombie apocalypse, and how the zombie apocalypse kind of pushes him to learn what's important and to figure out his own life. So a lot of the really good zombie movies are dealing with the living, not the dead so much. But certainly death is encroaching upon us, and it's biting at our heels, and it's coming and it's coming and it's coming. It's what you do in the meantime that is important, to stop the onslaught,
Ozzy, you gave us this great rundown of zombie film history and those sort of like the milestone movies along the way. I'm old enough to remember when zombie films, they were like the younger sibling of the more popular monster genres, and now it's absolutely ubiquitous. To the best of your ability, do you have an opinion, like what were the films or what were the junctures where it really just exploded into greater prominence than it ever had before?
What I mean, looking at it at Undead cinema just throughout the years, certainly Night of the Living Dead in 1968 was a watershed, and that no one had seen anything like that. Even the way that the film was made, and it was very realistic and very credible, and it came at a time during the just after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which was a big dark moment in American history, and also during the height of the civil rights movement. And the lead character who was cast in that movie, in Night of the Living Dead, was a black actor, Dwayne Jones, who played Ben. And when Romero and Russo wrote the script for Night of the Living Dead, they just assumed, they wrote it as it was just going to be a white actor, and this was a small independent film that they were making. And they did auditions, and someone, I think a friend of theirs, knew Dwayne, and they read him for the role of Ben, and he was great. He was the best actor. So they cast him because he was the best actor, and they never really discussed race in the movie, which is pretty incredible when you see a film in 1968 and the lead hero is a black actor, and they don't really even discuss race. It's amazing how the film is almost timeless that way. Certainly in today's culture, I think even now that's something that is kind of an easy story point. The Walking Dead in the first season, they talk about race and they have that exchange. So that was I think that being at the height of the civil rights movement, and at the end of that movie, the character's demise, as with all the characters in that movie, really kind of the audience kind of made it into a black film. It was right during the height of Martin Luther King's assassination, and that really was something that the filmmakers backed into, and it brought the film to greater prominence. And also in France, the Cahiers du Cinéma, spoke very highly of the filmmaking in Night of the Living Dead, and people started to respect the film as as cinema, as pure cinema. So that was a very important film, and it was so successful in the drive-thrus that other filmmakers started doing kind of knockoffs of that, and about 10 years later, Romero came back with Dawn of the Dead, which was basically his social commentary on consumerism, and he shot it all in a shopping mall. And the zombies were roaming around a shopping mall as the survivors were stuck in the shopping mall, and that discussed the kind of the dangers of consumerism and materialism, and then later on, I would say that video games were a huge impact on films and on the genre, and that certainly brought them back. And the Michael Jackson video, there's no doubt that was internationally renowned, and it's the Thriller video was also inducted into the National Film Registry, the first music video to do that because of its impact on pop culture in the United States. So, yes.
It was interesting to me that you talked about Dracula and Frankenstein and then zombies. Being as Bram Stoker's Dracula was such a character, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is such a character, and then the zombie seems to be a sort of anti-character, and just doesn't. And with all this talk about Hollywood moving away from stars and moving towards franchise, especially sort of Cape Crusader franchises. So, if you agree that the zombie is a sort of anti-character, what draws you to that? I mean, that sort of. I mean, it seems a kind of blank slate compared to a sort of more character-driven story.
Mm-hmm. What draws me to them as a genre?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, if you agree that they are sort of anti-characters.
I mean, I think when you say zombies, people know what the character tropes are for a zombie. Now it's if you were to ask someone what a zombie is today, their definition of what a zombie is today would be different than what a zombie was, in 1940, because it's almost like the creative concrete has hardened now, and everyone accepts what these tropes are, that they consume flesh, that they eat brains, which, by the way, was from a 1980s film called Return of the Living Dead, which had no connection to the original Night of the Living Dead. I mean, there was a connection, but they didn't consume brains in that film. So as far as them being an anti-character, I think that as a collective they're a character, obviously, and it's interesting to see how they've evolved almost in this open source, open collaboration throughout the years. They've become this character, and that defines them now today in The Walking Dead and World War Z. But the genre is so malleable that it changes. They can run. You can have fast zombies. You can have slow zombies. It depends on the story that you want to tell and what your social observation is in your story. If you're actually telling a story and you're not just exploiting the genre for commercial means. So. Hey.
2 questions.
Yes, sir.
1, favorite zombie movie, and 2, have you seen Juan of the Dead?
I have to say Juan of the Dead is probably one of my favorite zombie movies, without a doubt. Juan of the Dead is the first Cuban zombie film shot entirely on the communist island a few years ago. And directed by Alejandro Brujes, and it's I do mention it in the book. It's really a wonderful satire on the zombie genre, and it certainly respects the George Romero tropes of slow lumbering zombies, and I think it also is very inspired by Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead as well. It's a very entertaining movie. But Shaun of the Dead is wonderful. Dawn of the Dead is fantastic. Night of the Living Dead. There's a lot of good zombie movies that are just good stories, and they're just thrilling thrilling films, on their own. Even if you don't necessarily like the horror genre or zombie genres, I think that's why they're so popular with everybody. But.
What about War of the Z?
World War Z.
World War Z. What would you think prompted Hollywood to spend, so much money on a film like that? And I didn't follow the box office, but did they make their money back? And I found it interesting that they would do that even with Brad Pitt, the name attached to it.
There were a few films that came before it. First of all, it was based on a best-selling New York Times best-selling novel by Max Brooks, World War Z, which was very, very popular around the world, and I think that they also saw that there was this interest with the public, with The Walking Dead and Zombieland, and all these movies. And the movie was developed over the course of a long span of years. Many writers worked on it. And obviously Brad Pitt's attachment as a producer, because it was his company that acquired the rights. That was also something that was very important for the studio. But as far as the financial side of that movie, no one really knows the financial sides of movies. I mean, it's what's reported. But as nobody really. But according to the numbers that are there, they did get their investment back, and they were profitable on that movie. How much? Certainly not as profitable as White Zombie in 1932. That had a $75,000 budget in 1932, and made a 1.4 million or whatever it was, 1.7 million. That's a big margin. So if it
What was the budget of Z?
It was north of 200 million. Which is is what they report. Nobody who knows really what it was with marketing costs and all that. But supposedly it made back $500 million around the world, and they can they're working on a sequel to that apparently. So now yeah.
I have kind of a lightweight question, and then maybe something of a more serious question perhaps. First question is are there any nations where the film goers are particularly zombie mad? And second, do you think...
Other than the United States.
Other than the United States, yeah. And second, do you think that zombie films like sci-fi tends to reflect what's going on in the zeitgeist? Or is it only certain zombie movies, like you mentioned, the film that takes place in the film from the 80s in the shopping mall? Is the arc of zombie films comment on society at large, or is it only one or two here and there?
I think, like any films, good genre films, just like any other films, reflect society and do a good job at telling and being reflective of what's going on in society and what's in the zeitgeist. So, but obviously not all films do that, because some are, just exploited for commercial means. They exploit the character of zombies. So the Night of the Living Dead obviously did that, and Dawn of the Dead did that. And George Romero in general, he's continued to make zombie films obviously throughout the 80s and 90s, and most of his films have social commentary. Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later came out just after 9/11, so I would say that the most successful and the highly respected films have a story to tell and do reflect the times in which they're made. Yeah. Any other questions?
Are you familiar with Warm Bodies?
Yeah, Warm Bodies. Mm-hmm.
Is that the only storyline like a William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example of how malleable the genre actually is, where you have an author who took the idea of zombies and well, that's also also how, you know, a commentary on how great Shakespeare is, where they were able to take the Romeo and Juliet kind of storyline from Shakespeare and apply it to zombies, where it's a zombie and an undead zombie and a girl who's a survivor, and how her love for him and his love for her brings him back to life. And that's a zombie movie which was aimed at the younger demographic, at teens, just like Romeo and Juliet was, and was extremely successful at the box office. The adaptation of Warm Bodies, which was a book that it was based off of.
Not really knowing where zombies came from, but there's this legend that, you know, they come from Haiti,
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. Why was it that it was immediately taken away from that context, or that religious or semi-religious?
You're asking where was it, or why did it deviate from the Haitian roots? Yeah, the first movie was that, but then
and then it was immediately pulled out from there, and I don't think ever mentioned again.
Yeah, well, actually, it wasn't immediate. It was in the 1940s. You had a very popular movie called The Ghost Breakers, which was a comedy with Bob Hope and Paulette Goddard, which involved her character getting her family's. I think she was the heir of her family had a mansion in Cuba, and she went down there, and the mansion was haunted, and there was a zombie there that was scaring them. But so the roots were kind of there, and I think in the 1950s, because of the audience's perception, I wouldn't say lack of interest, but audiences had other fears and other anxieties, which were more reflective of the Cold War and the nuclear age, that filmmakers and storytellers, to dovetail it back to what you were saying, were making films that reflected the current anxieties of the time, and people would relate a little bit more to their anxieties and their fears of an atomic age that was considered dangerous and deadly. So a lot of these characters, a lot of these zombie movies were written to cater to those anxieties, and so you saw them deviating, but it was throughout the course of 20 years or so, from 1932 through the 1950s, that they started to deviate and become a little bit more science fiction, but the idea of an evil sorcerer putting a spell on that kind of stayed, but instead of the evil sorcerer, it became aliens from another planet who, in Ed Wood's film, and originally entitled Grave Robbers from Outer Space, and then in the 1960s, George Romero took that and completely brought them to our shores, which was also relatable to people, in Western countries that had films and a lot of drive-ins. So that became relatable to audiences, and that stuck and became successful. So they stayed in suburbia, the zombies. But you did have films. Every once in a while, you'll have a film that takes those roots back to Haiti, like The Serpent and the Rainbow in the 1980s. And there's a few films that still talk about the Haitian roots of what a zombie is.
Your resume is very impressive. Is your work in film on the technical side, or generally, or what sort of branch of film have you been involved in particularly?
I most recently work with writers and directors doing research, and production designers doing research on films, and and a lot of them are obviously nowadays adaptations or comic book adaptations, and that kind of bridge between what's on the page and what will end up on the screen, that that caters to fans and has the spirit of the comic book, or of whatever the book is in mind, as it's translated to the visual medium of film, or motion pictures, because nowadays there's a lot of digital photography too, obviously. So. Yeah.
So, question: you mentioned video games
Yes.
as like and a big one, Resident Evil.
Yep.
So how do you feel about the whole the success of one going into because Resident Evil is as a movie franchise, it's been pretty successful.
It's been almost
now.
$1 billion franchise.
Yeah. So how do you see that? I guess, and I ask because I know people on the team for Resident Evil, like the video game team, Albert Wesker, and so I guess the success of one leading to another, good, bad, or.
Well, I mean, I guess if you're talking profits, it's good. If you're talking storytelling or social commentary or things like that, I guess you take it on a case-by-case basis on what the intention of the producers are when they're creating that product. But I think the films have been extremely successful, and certainly with the demographic, and they've like I said, it's the Resident Evil films. They're now working on the 6th film, and that's also an interesting story, because the lead protagonist in the Resident Evil franchise, which is an action franchise, is a woman played by Mila Jovovich, which is also something you don't see every day, other than the Alien franchise and just recently Luc Besson's Lucy. So it's interesting that the genre that was kind of spawned by independent filmmakers has that spirit, where you have one of the first films with a black actor as a lead in that movie, Night of the Living Dead, and then Resident Evil, one of very, very few pictures where you have a female protagonist as the action heroine, throughout that franchise. Very successful franchise, and the lead character is played by a woman, by Mila Jovovich. So I think it talks about the power of the genre, and how fans embrace the genre, and good, just fun and good storytelling. So yeah.
If we remove the zombies and we focus on the living,
yeah,
and we have in the storyline a global epidemic, what is your favorite?
On global epidemic films?
Global epidemic films, but not necessarily focusing on the zombies, but on the living. What, in other words, what do you think is in reality what could happen if we do have a global epidemic? And what film do you think represents better?
Yeah.
What really is going to happen in society?
Well, I mean, certainly 28 Days Later is post-apocalyptic. That's after the character wakes up. That's a great movie to see. Wakes up almost like The Walking Dead. I mean, a lot of it is similar. Again, these cultural transferences where people borrow from other films and from other stories, where the character wakes up in a hospital. He wakes up from a coma and discovers this post-apocalyptic world with these infected zombies or infected people. There's a lot of conjecture whether they're zombies or not, but obviously the tropes are the same. And I consider it a zombie movie. Others disagree. That's okay. But that's post-apocalyptic. If you look at Night of the Living Dead, which was the first film to really do that, you have characters in that movie that are just finding out, just learning with the audience at the same time what is going on. And it tracks them, as they listen to the radio and watch television. And it's very reminiscent, sometimes eerily reminiscent, of John F. Kennedy's assassination, when Walter Cronkite, delivered to the American public what happened, and people were shocked learning this information. So it kind of, it's almost like a real-time storytelling, and it's very enclosed. That you're always with your characters in this house as this epidemic of zombies is happening supposedly globally, but they don't really explain that. And in that particular story, it really is about the living. It's about the people in this farmhouse and how they communicate with each other. And that's what the filmmaker was trying to really talk about, the disintegration of society brought about by the lack of communication and the lack of tolerance and understanding with the living, and how that conflict brings the living dead closer and closer and closer to them until they consume them, because the living they don't have their shit together, so to speak. So that's probably the most realistic. If you're kind of pessimistic about the human race, where people aren't coming together to solve the crime, and also World War Z kind of does that to an extent. They talk about what that's like, Yeah.
What's your favorite part in your job? The gentleman was asking, and you become an expert at this really crazy things. Like when you did Green Lantern and you had to do all the research, your job was to do research for the design team as to what that world was like, and then the book came out, I suppose the same for here. What's your favorite part when you start doing this research, and aren't you surprised sometimes how you become an expert at this very unusual subject?
Yeah, I'm very blessed, and it's wonderful to come in. I mean, as storytellers or even journalists, maybe we're able to take different assignments and different subjects and really research them and try to find what the story is and try to find what makes them interesting, and then present them to the public and present our what we see in that story. And that's phenomenal, because you get to learn about different things. And I worked on The Patriot, and that was American Revolution, American revolutionary film. And like you said, comic book movies like Spider-Man and all subject matters that I've, like everybody, has touched at some point in their life, in history class, or when you were a kid reading comic books, or an adult reading comic books, and then to be able to really focus in on that. Is fantastic. And like I said, that lady at the event in Salt Lake City, who said to me and the documentary filmmaker, she said, "How do you guys do it? You're so it's so dark, the zombie. How do you live with zombies every day?" And I said, "Well, this is a book that I wrote that and this is a film that he did that focuses on zombies, and based on our research and the knowledge that we've acquired to tell this story, which is the evolution of zombies in film, and then we move on to the next subject, Which
dovetails with my question. I'm sure this book has been keeping you busy for a while, but can you share with us the projects that you're currently involved in?
Some of them I can't discuss because there's but there's films in the studio system that I've done some research on for directors and writers, and I have my own projects that we're going around town hustling, doing meetings on, and that are in different genres, But certainly it influenced a lot. All my work and my research on this subject matter, it influenced my I would say love of horror and what the genre can do for storytelling. It's great.
All right. Are there one last question for Ozzy before we sign some books? Okay, then if there are no more questions, I have a quick reminder for our internet audience watching at home. You still have time to call the number on your screen, purchase a copy of the book, we'll get it signed, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have Zombies on Film as well as Constructing Green Lantern for sale at the counter over there. Ozzy's going to be signing over there at the table to the right of the screen, and this has been so much fun. Can we please give Ozzy a hand? Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for coming. Thank you. Thanks, Victor.